Okay, so our third and final part C of today's lesson. Guys, I'm hoping you're technologically aware enough to have been clicking on them in the right order. I think I send them out in the right order, but just make sure you've got A, B, C. And I do appreciate that I verbally said well, this was lesson 2, but it's on the YouTube as lesson 1. It's because it's lesson 1 uploaded. Okay, so we're talking now about complex social grouping. Okay, so a social group is one or two people that begin to meet and socialize and interact with each other based on social factors. So the social factors determine the people that we group with in theory, but it's much more complex. Okay, so this is quite complex in terms of the definitions. This is what we call our A grade moment. So we're all going to introduce these terms. I'm going to talk through all of them with you, but I would like you to mentally make a note that this is A grade. So we've kind of worked up through, I never go lower than a C grade content. So that understanding of social factors and intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is our C grade knowledge. This is now bridging us from the B's to the A's. Okay, so because they're complex, we're going to introduce it today, establish a knowledge base of it today. We're going to get you something to do with the knowledge to start internalizing it, but the investment in terms of learning it, questioning it, revising it, will be guided by how much your intrinsic motivation to really get the A. Okay, so what we recognize then is that rather than just social groups, this lovely, beautiful umbrella term, that there are actually 4 ways that we talk about social groups, 4 terms, okay? Now, there is tension and overlap across these groups. They are not distinctive individual definitions that can easily be applied. As is always the way with language, we love complexity, but it's our fault because we're complex human beings and therefore our language is complex to reflect our nature. And also, as you see in the middle of this diagram, we've got the concept that one of the reasons for tension is that the construction of identity is based on so many factors. Now, these 3 words, performative, enacting, and characteristics, okay, are A grade terms, A grade academic terms when we want to talk about people's behavior, how their language is maybe being determined by social groups. So, for example, we might talk about somebody's language being performative. Now, although the word itself might be new, it's linked to something you're going to be really familiar with, performing. This idea that people sometimes will use language in a performative way in other words, people perform. Right now, I am performing. You might not see it. My hands are waving now. I am performing. In other words, what am I performing? I am performing as a teacher. I don't speak to my children like this. I don't record messages for my children and leave them on YouTube to teach them things. Maybe I should. But this is me in a performative role as your teacher. Therefore, I am enacting certain characteristics. So enacting characteristics means as a result of the role that I'm choosing to perform, I enact characteristics. In other words, I put on a show. I put on a performance. I enact certain aspects. Now, we also see this when we come on to gender in a term or two's time. You know, that we might recognize that people enact their gender. In other words, somebody can be hyper masculine or hyper feminine in one context and then very just kind of like a bit more balanced, a bit less hyper in another. So we recognize that people could enact. In other words, people are choosing how to adapt and adopt the language that best suits them in a given context. And we are really good at making those choices. They might be subconscious choices, but actually across the course of the day, you probably transition and perform in 2 or 3 different roles. Yeah, there's the teacher versus the mother versus the real me. Who is the real me? Do you know what I mean? It's that kind of inaction. Teacher is different to when I'm mothering, which is different to when I'm with my friends, which is different to when I'm on my own. Now, that doesn't make me a hypocrite. That doesn't make me two-faced if there's integrity. In other words, if I'm authentic in whatever roles I'm in, and there's integrity, that I'm honest to certain aspects about my beliefs and attitudes, whatever I'm doing, then it's okay that I can take on different roles. It's just nature's way. If, however, you meet somebody and you get the sense that they are, we might use that colloquial term, a bit two-faced, or you don't trust them, or they seem a bit fake, then actually we are really good as human beings at discerning that. And then we don't accept it, or it makes us a bit cautious, or we might reject a relationship with somebody like that. We tend not to trust two-faced people. So when we talk about performative, or enacting characteristics. It doesn't necessarily always have to take us to a negative place of somebody being fake or somebody being manipulative or somebody being two-faced. It's actually very natural that in order to cope with different social situations, our identities do transition in various degrees, various shades of me. Yeah, the danger becomes when the transitions are so dramatic that people don't trust me, that I'm inauthentic, that they don't trust my integrity. They then begin to think that I'm fake and two-faced. Okay, so those are those keywords in the middle. So performative, the idea that people perform, and we use language as part of our performance. Enacting characteristics means that we, again, part of that performance, we might act or draw upon certain characteristics of language that go with a particular role. So you can pause there and rewind that and write that down if you like. Okay, so let's have a little look then at these four more complex areas. Okay, so over here, communities of practice. Okay, so communities of practice are formed by people. So in other words, social groups, these are four different types of social groups. So social groups, communities of practice. These are formed by people who engage in a process of collective learning. Okay, so some people coming together to learn stuff in a shared domain of human endeavour. So that bit sounds a bit formal, but in other words, communities of practice are literally groups coming together to practice something, to learn something. So the word there is practice. Okay, so a community of practice is people coming together to practice something, to learn something. And it's a shared thing. So we all meet up every week as a community of practice to learn something about A-level language. So here are some examples. A tribe learning to survive, a band of artists seeking new forms of expression, a group of engineers working on similar problems, a clique of pupils defining their identity in school. And they will always use language as part of that process. So language is used in a community of practice to help people learn, to share what they're learning with each other. So a band of artists will use language to talk about forms of expression, music. A tribe learning to survive will use language, to communicate with each other. How are we going to cross this river? How are we going to make food? And that's what a community of practice is. Groups of people coming together to learn something. But the learning will have, it says here, a shared domain of human endeavour. In other words, it will have an outcome. So we are a community of practice. We are a group of people, teachers and students, who are coming together to learn. Okay, and our outcome is going to be to learn to such an extent that you get the grade you want. And we're going to use language as part of that. Okay, so communities of practice. Now, the practice word there means that's how we learn. We learn through practice, we learn through memorizing, we learn through talk to understand concepts. Okay, so communities of practice. Now, a community of practice is potentially very similar initially to this one, a discourse community. So a discourse community is a group of people who share a set of discourses understood as basic values and assumptions and ways of communicating about these goals. A gentleman, a linguist called John Swells, defined discourse communities as groups that have goals or purposes and use communication to achieve these goals. So this is people that use language for group thinking. So it's all about language. Now, how is that different to a community of practice? So a community of practice, you are all in it to learn something. It's all about learning. There is an outcome where the success of a community of practice is that they will have learned. They would have survived. They would have created a new form of expression. The engineers would have achieved the outcome to the problem. The clique would have established their identity. So communities of practice, are you ready for this, are outcome driven. They all will know they've been successful when they've achieved that outcome. And then the community of practice might disband. So they might stop meeting. So the group of engineers, they've solved the problem. They don't meet anymore. The clique at schools, once they know who they are then moving on to the next level of education or to work, and they don't necessarily take that group with them. As wonderful as your next 2 years of A-level language is going to be, at the end of 2 years, you will move on to your next stage of education, and I won't go with you. I stay behind. Sad moment. Okay, so a community of practice has an outcome, an agreed shared outcome that has to be achieved. Okay? And it's finite, it has an endpoint. Discourse communities, because it's actually people that are coming together, okay, although they have goals and purposes, those goals and purposes are ongoing. Okay? So discourse community might have an ongoing discussion about goals. So for example, I've been a teacher for 20 years. Yeah. So I am part of the Tall Point discourse community. I've been here for 20 years. Now you could argue it's going to end one day when I'm forced to retire, but it's a longer term goal than a community of practice. Okay. And it's about group thinking. So the other thing that makes a discourse community different is that we're not just talking about the goal. We're not just talking about how to survive. Sorry, we're not just talking about the outcome. We're talking about how we get there, the journey. So I might sit down in a discourse community and talk about what I value, what's important to me, and we might not even get to the goal. We might not get to the solution. But the discourse community gives me a space within which I can talk about it. So discourses means things that topics and understanding, attitudes that we are agreeing on. So you might have a discourse community, okay, where you meet with people because you have the same shared values and assumptions. So actually, it's a very technical term, but your family is a discourse community. Your club is a discourse community. Your group of friends is part of your discourse community, and you all come together and use communication in that way. Your workplace is a discourse community. So you can see that actually communities of practice and a discourse community really do overlap. They're very similar. Okay, they're both using language to talk about goals. A community of practice is seemingly more finite. Once they've solved the problem, once they've established something, they then have learnt it and they might move on. Whereas because the discourse community, it's about values and assumptions, they might stay together a bit longer. But you can see those two are really similar. Now, when you've got two that are really similar, it's through practice that we'll unpack those differences. So I don't want you to panic about that too much today. Now, the last two, subculture. Now, a subculture is a cultural group, a social group within the larger culture. They often have beliefs or interests at variance with those of the larger culture. So I love this one. This is the easiest to get your head around. So within any society, within any community group, your subculture is those that are seemingly in opposition with the rest of the culture. Okay, now there are some really stereotypically identified subcultures. So within a social structure, the subculture tends to be the youth. The youth represent a subculture. They have different beliefs and interests than the larger mainstream culture. We might talk about mainstream culture, mainstream beliefs, traditional beliefs, and therefore those that are a subculture might be groups that are at odds with those. So a subculture is a smaller group within a larger culture that's at odds. So go back to the 1980s and you got your punks. Okay, your punks were a subculture that went against the beliefs and interests. We might talk about the subculture as being in rebellion or opposition. So at the moment, if you like, we've got subcultures all the time. Yep, I blame social media. It creates lots of subcultures with people who are angry with bigger society, bigger culture, and so are banding together. Okay, so subculture, a group of people within a larger culture. Now, a social network is a social structure that's made up of a set of groups who begin to interact based on shared personal or career interests, activities, backgrounds, or real life connections. So here you can see what's different is a network this is a map of connections made up of individuals or organizations. So look at your Facebook, look at the groups that are coming up. So for example, a social network is perfectly illustrated by Facebook. Okay, so a social network doesn't have to be face-to-face. It doesn't have to be personal interaction at a face-to-face level. It is a social structure made up of a set of social groups. Okay, now your job, just for today, because these are big ideas that we're going to just start to get our heads around, we will come back to them, okay, is just now to recreate that map, but is in a way that paraphrases the information, okay? So you're going to try and recreate the map of those 4 social groups, but using your own words to summarize and paraphrase the information. So you're starting to translate it for yourselves. Okay? And once you've done that activity, answer these questions by going back over today's notes. Okay, guys? So I will speak to you and record tomorrow's lesson for you and have that available soon.